Hey guys, it's Miss Hall here with another video for you all in our final unit. We are talking about nationalism, and this is, remember, the new nationalism that happened in the 20th century and actually is continuing into the 21st century. Today's video is on nationalism in Asia. We've already looked at India and Africa, and we're going to look today at how the Asian countries began to assert their independence and their unique identities. All right, the first nation that we're going to look at is Japan. And Japan was really forced to rebuild after the devastation that happened to them in World War II. And the US occupied Japan and they introduced economic and political reforms. And even when they withdrew from Japan in 1952, they continued to maintain really close ties and be a trading partner for Japan. And that really helped the Japanese economy. And Japan knew that they needed to produce something to export, and so they very quickly actually built efficient modern factories that produced high quality products. They were actually better than the factories in Europe that were starting to become outdated. And by the 1970s, Japanese cars, cameras, televisions, all sorts of high-tech industries found eager buyers in the world market, and they became a real leader in the high-tech industry. Today, Japan faces a lot of the same challenges that other developed nations face. They have a pretty heavy dependence on foreign oil. They still face political stresses and conflict over who will be their leader. And they also have very overcrowded urban areas and struggle with poverty in those regions. Now, while the time after the war really brought prosperity to Japan, things didn't really go down that way in China. So China was involved in a pretty intense civil war following World War II. And it ended when Mao Zedong, who was the leader of the People's Republic of China and a communist leader, took power. And Mao launched a bunch of different efforts to really build socialism and to attempt to repair the economy in China. And what that meant basically was taking over things that had previously been private and independent and making them government run. In an effort to improve farms, he created communal farms, and in an effort to increase industry, he created what he called backyard industries. And these programs, which he called the Great Leap Forward, proved to really be a failure and a flop. They did not increase production, and what they did produce was low quality and useless. And the communal farms actually slowed down food production, which led to a massive famine. And he really had to take a step back, and they had to go a little bit more moderate with their policies and recover. And they did. They began to recover from the Great Leap Forward, which actually took them back a step. But in 1966, just as they were recovering, Mao had another great idea to move China forward that ended up not really doing that. And this was what came to be known as the Cultural Revolution. It was the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. And the goal of the revolution was to really cement socialism in the country and remove all of the capitalist elements of Chinese society, to get rid of what was known as the Four Olds, which were the old ways of doing things. But in doing so, the really major changes that were made to the political and economic and social nature of China really ended up being somewhat violent and having somewhat negative effects on the country. Now, we're going to learn a little more about the Cultural Revolution in class, but basically it ended with Mao Zedong's death in 1976. And even though there were a lot of mistakes made in the Cultural Revolution, many still saw Mao as a revolutionary hero who restored order and ended the foreign domination of China. But after him, more moderate leaders did come into power. And Deng Xiaoping helped set China on a better path, and he emphasized what he called the four modernizations, and his goal was to modernize agriculture, industry, science, and defense. And these really did bring a surge of growth and a better standard of living to many of the Chinese. And China today is a pretty major industrial power, and its economy is actually one of the fastest growing in the world. But they still face a lot of challenges. There's a strict distinction between the rich and the poor and the urban and the rural in China. In the late 1980s, the tension over these inequalities began to really grow as many Chinese began demanding greater freedom and new economic reform. And in May of 1989, tens of thousands of students gathered to demonstrate in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, and they were calling for democracy. And the government pretty swiftly sent in troops with tanks. And thousands of demonstrators were killed or wounded, and many others were arrested and either tortured or put to death. It was a really clear demonstration that China's communist leaders were determined to maintain order and control. And as time went on, efforts from the West to improve human rights issues in China, they've mostly failed. Basically, China says, mind your own business, we'll do things our way. One area where you may have heard about human rights violations in China has to do with one of the things they put in place to control population. Because China is growing so fast, their population was out of control. And so the government did put in place a law that encouraged families to only have one child. They received rewards and benefits for only having one, and penalties and fines for having more than one. And this did lead to some pretty atrocious things because this is a society where boys are valued over girls. Sometimes first daughters were put to death. Now, this was not government sanctioned. The government actually put things in place to try to prevent the infanticide of these infant girls, but it still did continue despite government control. And that's just one of the things that really sparked upset with China. Now today, there are still political unrest and still human rights violations going on in China, but they are still and are increasingly becoming a real power player in the world's economy. Well, that's about it for our look at nationalism in the Asian nations. I hope you were able to get a good picture of how these nations kind of developed their own identity, their own national identity after World War II, and the role that they're currently playing in the world. If you have questions, as always, ask your teacher.